Welcome to the TTA's Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Welcome back to TTS Talking Early Years with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Ruth Swailes. And in this episode, we're going to be talking all about skills and knowledge that we need to build an effective curriculum and learning in the foundation stage. So again, Ruth, in episode 1, we talked a little bit about skills and also the pressure that sometimes practitioners are under to impart knowledge, and the fact that that's sometimes seen as being the primary aim of an adult who's in a teaching role, just to deliver knowledge. But in terms of skill development, that can also hold equal, if not more importance than the knowledge children gather, because it can enable them to gather that knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's not an either or, is it? It's not a, it's both. We need both.
So I think you're right. It's not an either or. We do need both. And I think skill development as well comes a lot from not just the role of the adult in interacting with children, but a lot of skills children can develop from really good quality continuous provision. So continuous provision being that thing that happens outside of the adult, the spaces the children go and inhabit, often in earliest foundation stage, for the majority of their time, because most of our children do spend most of their time in foundation stage, not in a direct one-to-one knowledge exchange with an adult.
Yeah, although increasingly I'm seeing continuous provision being pushed out and pushed to the sides, and it almost becoming something that you do when you've done the stuff, sometimes we send that message that this is what you do when you finish the important stuff. And for me, I think we need to see provision is a big part of our curriculum, and that was one of the challenges with writing the Oxford curriculum, because you're working with people. Whenever I'm writing a curriculum, and I've written many with schools, my own schools over the years, but also with schools that I've supported in school improvement, I always start with the questions around, like, tell me about your school community, tell me about your children, tell me about your staff, and you try to build a unique curriculum based on the statutory framework, but also what you know about child development, and then the community within that. And then to come to write a curriculum for schools that you've never visited, in countries that you've never visited, people you never met, it's quite tricky. Yeah. And one of the conversations I had with the editor was, do the countries who are going to use this understand the concept of the environment as third teacher? That concept comes from Loris Malaguzzi. And he said some of them will be deeply, sort of invested in that and really understand it. And for other people, that will be a completely new concept. So a lot of the work had to go into what we mean by an enabling environment. And I think we bandy that word around quite a lot. And I probably think that we need to unpick it, even here in England. I think we need to sit down and talk about, what does an enabling environment mean to you? And talk about that as a team, because I think, we use the word continuous provision, we use the word enabling environment, but do we actually know that we all mean the same thing? And when I've done this in schools with people, sometimes, I've walked around, I spend a lot of time walking around doing what I call a narrated visit, which is where I walk around with people who will say to me, I think it's good, but I don't really know what I'm looking at. So I'll say, right, I'll talk to you about what I'm seeing. And when I talk about what curriculum is happening in the environment and the purpose of the environment and how that's supporting it, the number of people who kind of go, oh, I get it now. It's not just stuff. So no, you thought really carefully about every resource that you choose, how you arrange your furniture, your timetable, all of that is given just as much thought, if not more so,
than what you teach. I think those narrated wander rounds are really powerful to do. And I think sometimes for people who often, because when you're a practitioner and you're in the space and you're setting it up and it becomes yours, it's a bit like when you live in your own house. When you walk in with fresh eyes, you see different things. But I often try and encourage early years leads or anybody that's trying to articulate their space to try and do that with somebody else, be that another member of their team or another member of the school community that isn't, if you're in a school, that isn't au fait with early years. Because just by talking about what you see and why it's there really helps you to kind of also see the gaps, but also articulate what you've done and why.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful things, and I recommend this to all settings, is for you to sit with your team just once a week for 5 minutes in a space and talk about what learning might happen here, because I think after a while it does become a bit like wallpaper. I remember my school improvement advisor visiting and saying, "What's that doing there, Ruth?" And you think, actually, what is that doing there? I don't really know. It's always been there,
Yeah.
and what job is it doing? And just to do that together. So that means you don't have to do this thing where you've got to write down all the words you're going to say, because you've had a conversation together.
Yeah.
About, what are the resources for? What learning might happen here? Have we got the right resources? Because sometimes a space can look, really lovely and inviting, and then you sit down in it and look at it from a child's perspective, and you're like, oh, actually, I can see why the play's a bit superficial in here.
Yeah.
There's not the right resources, or they're not challenging enough, or they're too challenging. And just having that conversation about what learning might happen, what conversations might I have here? And I use the word might, not word.
I was going to say the important word there is the might word, because when we get, and again, there's a phase that we went through in foundation stage where you'd go into people's setup, and on the end of every unit they would have a little piece of paper that said, in this area you can, and there must be, and the language must be. And then you've got adults who are sticking to that rigidly. And again, we get pushed down a cul-de-sac where we're not responding to children any longer. We're thinking, all right, if in case anybody walks in, I need to be using these keywords and, using these resources in this space.
I think that is the danger. I think, and so I'm not a massive fan of having those things around. I'm not one of these consultants who will say to people, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, unless it's the law. I always say to them, this is your judge dress stuff. He used to say, I am the law. This is what you've absolutely got to do.
You're really aging yourself there. Only you and I get that bit.
Yeah, but that was he would say, I am the law, and this is it, and you can't get away from it. If you don't like it, it's tough, because this is the law, you've got to do it, it's statutory. And I sort of joke and say, if you don't do this, the play police are going to come around and arrest you. But it's serious, you've got to make sure you do that. Everything else you have to look through the lens of, what will this look like in my classroom? So I make suggestions either based on research, on things that I've done, on things that I've done myself in my classroom, or I've done with other schools. And then I'll say to them, right, what do you think about that? But ultimately, you have to make it work. I drive away at the end of the day. You are in that classroom every day. So I'm not one of these people who says, don't stick the words everywhere. But if you've got words everywhere, my first question will be, what's the purpose of those and why? Yeah. And sometimes people put them there because they feel they've got to have them. And I think it's a rare early years practitioner who doesn't know that in the sand, for example, you might talk about empty, full, pour, fill. I don't think you necessarily need those words there for your practitioners. The children aren't reading them, and it takes time, and everything, your time is so precious.
Yeah.
So actually, everything that you're doing needs to be having an impact on the children.
Yeah.
And that doesn't. So for me, that's a waste of your time. Far better to spend 5 minutes in that provision, having a chat and saying, what conversations might we have here? I wonder what, phrases we might use. And I'm a big fan of Julie Fisher's work, and her sort of sentence stems around things like, I wonder, perhaps we might, and really supporting people to get that idea and that confidence that we can have these open-ended conversations and be confident to do that. And I think as soon as you put a list on that at the end of that sandpit, then I'm looking at that list and checking out, and it just restricts everything. And I think this is one of the issues I have with this idea of a step-by-step curriculum, that this progression model that Ofsted has already been pushing. Because if you look at the front of Development Matters, it actually says, children's learning isn't linear, it's more like a spider web. And how can we sort of accommodate that within this linear progression model? And I just think we're in danger. I think it's Evangela who talks about the fact that, once you go down that route of steps, it restricts children's learning. And yes, I might go through these progressive steps, but actually I might be a child who goes off at a completely different time.
Absolutely.
Far, far deeper.
Yeah.
And what am I going to do? Say, stop that, you're only supposed to do this today.
Which I think genuinely does happen. And that's when the tambourine comes out and people are like, stop doing that, or come over to this space here. I think that thing you talked about where you say, if you can sit down, way more valuable than downloading stuff off whatever site you want to download off and laminating it, stick them in your space, to sit down and say, right, if we are in the sand and we have got 3 buckets of different sizes, 3 spades of different sizes and a sand wheel, that's all we've got. What opportunities are children going to do when we're not here? And again, you mentioned this in the last episode. I think if I'm ever doing any kind of learning walk with somebody who doesn't know much about early years or foundation stage, I often look out for the places where the adult isn't, because usually, especially when there are other adults in the room, we're all the same. You're a little bit like, oh, I'm doing what you're going to do. And a good adult is really good at facilitating learning with children, but I think you get to see where a space is really effective and if children are really engaged as opposed to being compliant by hunting out the spaces where the adult isn't inhabiting at that moment. And you get to have those conversations where you're looking at that provision and saying, right, what can we see here? Are we seeing children who are really engaged and absorbed, going back to those characteristics of effective learning? Or are we seeing children who haven't got that level of engagement? Are there lots of those? And having those conversations about how the environment can really play a role in not just enabling children's skill development, but engaging them in that process of learning.
Absolutely. And I think, when you start to look at it, really as a third teacher and think of it from that perspective and, think about that, one of the things I said to people for years is if you're doing a lesson observation, do you actually go down and talk to your foundation teacher about their provision? If the environment really is the third teacher, that should be part of your lesson observation, before you've even gone to visit. And I encourage people to go, people want to go and see something that is familiar to them. And I totally get that because, we can't all be experts in the whole of primary. We want people to be experts in the field. This new Ofsted framework is asking people to assess the quality of teaching and learning in their subject. And let's face it, in primary school, you might not be a specialist in that subject yourself. When I worked in a tiny 2-class primary school, literally an infant and junior class, I led on 6 subjects.
Yeah.
If you'd done a deep dive into my literacy, it would have been fine, absolutely. But if you'd done a deep dive into my music leadership, I could bash out look for signs that someone's done on the recorder. But actually, the rest of it is pretty,
dodgy.
It wasn't great. I'm going to be honest with you. We can't be experts in everything. And so to ask people to then say, what does that look like in early years? If you're a year 6 teacher, that is a huge challenge. And so what those people do is they look for things that are familiar. I liken it to when we go to, when you go abroad and you're walking down the street and you look for things that So, that's a pharmacy, that's a bar because I recognise the signs.
Yeah.
You're looking for the familiar. So your natural instinct as a year 6 teacher who's coming to look at history, for example, is to look for a lesson, because that's what you know. And I'll say to people, don't go and look at lessons because that rarely happens in the same way. Go and have a look at provision. And that feels really alien. So we need to hold people's hands when we're doing that and say, it's okay not to know.
Absolutely.
We found out. And I think, I would hate anybody to think I was being dismissive of heads who don't understand early years and of leaders who don't understand early years, because I get it. The job is really, really busy.
Well, and that's why you have early years leads that help you to manage your overall school, and they are your channel for that kind of. So what I often talk to people about is creating a language of communication between you and your senior leadership where you know what they're looking for. So rather than let them go and look for it or resort to things like, you need a literacy board, you need a numeracy board, or we're going to do a book scrutiny. Yeah, so you need working books because that's how we evaluate children's progress. And I know that can be difficult. And again, I don't want to be flippant about that, but trying to have that dialogue around, well, this is not appropriate for what we do in foundation stage, but this is what we do instead, or here is where you can see that knowledge.
I was going to say, when I was ahead, I was always happy if people came to me and said, I don't think I can do that, but this.
I can do this. Yeah.
If you get somebody who's saying that we can't do that, that's problematic. And I do think, sometimes people say that automatically. We can't do that in early years. And actually, I think we need to look through that different lens and say, how can we make this work in early years? How can we make it work so it's effective for our children, but it gives us what we need so that our leadership team feel confident that they can articulate it should somebody come and ask questions about it. I don't think that's impossible. It just needs a bit of navigation.
It does. And I think partly, again, talk to practitioners about taking control, because if you are the early years expert in your space and you're reading research or reading the blogs or listening to the podcasts, then take that information back. But always, again, I think it's because when, if you've been in the role of a head and you kind of see the overview of the whole school and the pressure you get as head from your local authority and everybody else, if somebody can come to you and say, here's a possible solution, that's like music to your ears, as opposed to, as you're saying, somebody just said, yeah, we don't do that. Or somebody that will say to a head, oh yes, attainment is wrapped in the enhancements to my continuous provision. And again, if you don't understand what any of those words mean, and you haven't got the time to go and find out, we want to be able to say, this is how it works. Yeah. Then the other thing that I'd just be interested to get your view on is, again, a couple of schools I've worked with where they've said, we very much believe in that Malagusi adage of the environment being the third teacher. But what that translates into is children have a carpet gathering, but then they go into provision, but all of the provision, or 90% of it, is linked to development matters outcomes. So it'll be put the dinosaurs in silo order, match the pneumicon to the pattern, make a pattern with these beads, find tricky words in the sand. So they're saying the environment is teaching because they've got outcome linked objectives in the play in inverted commas.
To me, that's not continuous provision, though. They're enhancements, and that's the difference. If you think about it like a bit like layers of the cake, So you sort of your direct teaching might be sort of maybe the icing on it, but the continuous provision is the stuff that is always available. It's the resources that you've thought about really carefully. You've chosen them carefully. The children can self-select them. You've modelled how to use them. My mantra is choose it, use it, put it away. They know how to do that. You've taught them how to look after the things, and they will use those resources in a different way over a long period of time. And they don't need to be changing all the time if you've chosen them carefully, because what a child does in September with those resources will be different to what
absolutely
in January. And for me, the challenge is in the conversations that you have with them, the questions that you ask, the depths of understanding that they get. And thinking about Ferrolava's work on wellbeing and involvement here, and how they go deeper and become more fascinated and take their learning deeper. So that's the provision. And then for me, what you're talking about there is enhancements. That to me isn't child-led, that's adult-led. So it might be adult-led independent, but the adult is making all of the choices there. So I come back to the characteristics here. And one of the things about characteristics, it talks about children making choices about how they learn, where they learn and what they learn. And if you are putting something in every single area, I feel that you are effectively saying to the children two things. First of all, my provision's not good enough, so I've got to enhance it.
Yeah.
In which case, why bother having the provision in the first place?
Yeah.
And secondly, you can't make choices. I'm making all the choices. Now, that to me isn't child-led. So I think enhancements really need to be used judiciously.
Yeah.
In my experience, if you put an enhancement in every area, children get flitty because they're going from this to this to this. And for me, the environment as third teacher also frees you up as a teacher to have those lovely serve and return interactions, which we know are the things that make the biggest difference to children's learning. So we know that when we are in provision with the children, having those conversations, that's when we are shaping their brain architecture. We're asking those questions and it changes the shape of their brain. There's extensive research that shows this. So if I've then got to run over there because actually in that area you're supposed to be doing that with the pneumicon, but what you're doing is something completely different and not what's on my plan, then I can't have those lovely conversations. I'm flitting. So what's the point? So I think a lot of people have fallen into the habit of thinking they've got to do that. And when I unpick it with teachers, they'll say, well, people might think I'm lazy if I don't put anything there. Well, actually, it's not about that. It's about what is this like for the children? Yeah.
And also it's about having that language to explain that and spend the time thinking about that and talking about that as a team. If you say, how many cups are going to fill this jug? Ask yourself the question, how many children are actually going to do that? Yeah. What you probably get is a compliant few who could probably do it anyway in their sleep. But the ones you're actually trying to target are the ones who are now outside on a scooter or tying a girl to the railings by their plaits. They're not the ones that are saying, oh, I wonder how many cups fit in this jug. Because as an adult, would you ever wonder how many cups fill the jug? No, probably not.
The really canny and brave children, when you get a "can you do this" question, will go no and walk away.
Yes.
The table, or yes, but I don't want to. One of my very favourite ever was can yous was can you read these CVC words? And I'd been pointing out to the head teacher why we probably wouldn't do this, and it was the head who actually sort of pointed to it and laughed, and he said, "Well, if I can read the question, then I can obviously read it." And I just thought that's brilliant. And we do that because I know why we do it. I know what drives it, because people don't understand what it is we do, because there's a lot of misconceptions, and because everybody's got an opinion about early years, whether they've taught it or not. We are preempting. We're preempting because we feel that people are going to come and question us. And I remember, do you remember Dame Rena Keeble's review of the curriculum in 2016? Yeah. I was fortunate to hear a talk at Westminster. And in that, she talked about there being confusion about early years. And she explained that in greater depth. And she said, when we went into an early years classroom and children were playing, the teacher would go up and say to to her and her team, I know they should be sitting at tables and writing, but they're only 4 and 5 and they need to play. When we went into an early years classroom and saw people sitting at tables and writing, guess what they did? They went up to her and said, I know we should be playing, but we've got to get them ready for year 1. And from that, she drew the conclusion that there was confusion. And I challenged that, and I said, actually, that's not confusion. That is anxiety. That is people who know they are preempting because they know that somebody's going to come and question them, because we always get questioned. And so what they're doing is they're thinking, she's going to think this, I'm going to do that. And I think we can take that and flip it. And I want to empower people to say, own it. So when somebody walks into your classroom, say, we are playing because, or we are doing this because, you know your children better than they do.
Yeah.
So you own it and talk about, this is why we're doing it. This is because it's backed with this research and the impact is this. Fine, because actually they're coming to observe you and you know your children. And I think we need to be a bit more assertive in our understanding and owning our practice and saying, no, this is right for the children. I've been talking a lot lately about ethics and advocacy. I think there's a lot of stuff that is happening that we need to challenge. And our role as early years practitioners is to advocate for children who are too young to do it.
I completely agree. And also, that is an excellent place to end this episode, because when we come back in episode 3, we're going to be talking about the often contentious issue of school readiness. What is it? What does it mean? And it links beautifully into what you've just been talking about. So for the moment, Ruth, thanks very much, but we'll see you in episode 3.
Thank you.
I would just like to say a huge thank you to our guest today, Ruth, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Ruth Swailes. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content. This includes ideas for your setting and lots of links to relevant resources.